as part of what we've spoken about today, I'm unfortunately not going to be taking a knock at your belief system. You can believe in whatever the hell you want. I'm not going to take a knock at your politics. You can support whoever you want, even if it's a puppet. But that's part of what my job is trying to talk about something else in South Africa. Because at the moment in South Africa, we generally talk about two things. We talk about our politics and our economics. And we use those metrics to inform all of our debate. So my job as a science editor is to give you a different perspective of South Africa, a country in which we can have world-class science sitting next to abject poverty. And the other part of what I do and why I'm speaking here today is because it's about informing people to make decisions. So the question that I get asked often when I give talks, I usually give talks about the SKA. I, for my sins, wrote a book on the SKA trying to make it accessible to everybody. It's called Searching African Skies. And now, one of the questions I get asked is, Sarah, what do you think about fracking? And as soon as someone asks me that, I think, oh, fuck. Because chances are, if they're asking me that question, A, they already have an opinion, B, they're trying to prove that they're smarter than me, and 3, they're trying to push their own agenda. Because they're not going to say to me, you know, Sarah, I'm really interested in fracking in the Karoo. How does it look versus the geological data that we can fracture open shale rock? That would be an interesting question. They're not going to ask me generally, how are we going to get the water? How are we going to transport water to the Karoo in order to fracture rock? That's not what they're going to ask me. They're going to say, how dare you destroy our Karoo? How dare you be any part of this? But what about the economics of it? No, I don't want to hear about economics. Economics don't matter. Those are that's the discourse that we in the media, and I say this as someone who's culpable in this, that is what we are doing. We are dumbing down debate. We are not giving you, and the public in general, the tools to have real arguments. There's a gentleman down in Cape Town. His name is J.P. Franzadisi. And next time I see him, I'm going to have to buy him whiskey because I talk about him a lot, or at least reference this. And he said to me, you know, Sarah, the problem is once your science finds its way onto a bumper sticker, you're screwed. Because you can't talk rationally to anybody. And now if we think about the major debates at the moment, even in South Africa as well as in the world, you've got your hydraulic fracturing, you've got nuclear, you've got GMOs. At the moment we have Tim Noakes, but I'll come back to that. Thank you very much for the lady who asked that question. I was sitting in the back thinking, yes. But if you look at these debates, if I ask someone, actually no, maybe this is a very bad sample of people to ask. If I ask somebody about nuclear, they will either be incredibly pro-nuclear, speaking about those stupid bloody greenies who are standing in the way of progress, or you're going to be talking to a greenie who says that we're going to walk into another Chernobyl. The Human Sciences Research Council did a survey of social attitudes towards nuclear, taking a sample of South Africa, and only 3% actually knew what nuclear technology was and how it worked. So how are we informing these debates? But it's not as easy as that. In fact, it's not an easy gig being a science journalist, because this is my favorite example. You go to a party. I'll pretend my boyfriend's not at the back listening to this. You go to a party, and you're talking to someone cute, and you're like, hey, I'm Sarah. And they're like, hey, how are you doing? And then they say, well, what do you do? And you say, I'm a science editor, like, nice to meet you. And they do this thing. It's called shoulder surfing. It's where you're talking to somebody, but they're actually looking over your shoulder, trying to find a better conversation. And I find this happens quite a lot when you start talking about science, because everyone, and I say everyone because the percentage of people who would think that science is incredibly cool, many of whom are in this room, you're in the minority. Because most people think it's really boring, that it has nothing to do with real life, that it belongs in corridors and is controlled by mathematics, all of which we really avoid if we have a calculator or a BlackBerry. So, how I see my role as a science journalist to try and bridge this divide between what is very, very inaccessible, and I'll admit it. I was on Eusebius's show and earlier this month, and we were talking about nanosatellites. Very, very small, teeny satellites. These ones are about 10 centimeters squared. And he said, Sarah, why do they call them nanosatellites? And I said the first thing which came into my head, which was because they're trying to sound smart, which is perhaps not the best thing to say on national radio. But for the most part, it's jargon. We wrap these disciplines in jargon and make them inaccessible. And we're impoverishing people from, firstly, knowing really, really cool stuff, and secondly, from thinking things through. And I'm not just using that as a hokey phrase, it actually works. Where we're trying to broaden the discourse and make our people smarter. But scientists are culpable of this. The best example is I was at Wits University and I was talking to one of their professors who shall remain nameless, although one day he's going to find me. And we were talking about his research, and he said, well, I study hyperaccumulator flora residing in serpentine regions. And I'm taking notes, and then I'm not taking notes, and I'm thinking, excuse my language, putative in-laws, fuck, I can never turn this into a story. What he actually studies is he studies a plant which sucks heavy metals out of the ground, a hyperaccumulator. Hyperaccumulator flora, a plant which accumulates heavy metals in serpentine regions. Serpentine regions are naturally toxic or man-made toxic, like mine dumps. So he's suddenly talking about a plant which they're trialing in Rustenburg where they're leaching nickel out of the ground. So all of a sudden we're having a very different conversation. But the problem is that it's very difficult to get this into newspapers, because newspapers in South Africa sell on politics. I have yet to work at a newspaper where I haven't been bumped off for Julius Malema. The man really is the bane of my life. Because we will always go for politics. And that is why we need to start engaging in this discourse so that people will see that there is another way of looking at South Africa specifically, and our schizophrenia. So I do stealth science. It's why I don't work for a Popular Mechanics or a New Scientist. Because people who go to Popular Mechanics or New Scientist know what they're looking for. They're the ones who are on Slate or Boing Boing. They know that they want to find science somewhere. I'm interested in everyone else. I'm interested in the people who are going to find their science between their politics and their economics, like ninja science, where you do it by stealth mode. So that we have a situation. My utopia is where all of a sudden you're around the water cooler and there's a discussion. So what do you think of this coal bed methane thing? Well, I'm very concerned about that. Fugitive hydrocarbons is something that we should all be concerned about in terms of natural gas extraction. But I wonder with South Africa's reserves. I have very strange conversations in my head. Yes, this might actually be a great conversation. But that's the level of discourse that we need to start engaging with if we're going to address the manifold problems in South Africa. So I wrote a book on the SKA, and the question that I'm often asked in interviews, especially if the interviewer doesn't like me and is trying to put me on the spot, is how can South Africa justify building this huge scientific experiment when people don't have houses? When millions of children in South Africa will go to sleep hungry, how can we spend money on science? And there is a fantastic piece of legislation. It's called the Science and Technology White Paper of 1996. And one of its phrases is why we must focus on the basic sciences is because otherwise we, quote, forever chain ourselves to the treadmill of feeding and clothing ourselves. And I believe that that also forms part of our discourse. We will forever chain ourselves to these emotional conversations that where belief triumphs data, Tim Noakes, and sorry. I'm going to get some very rude emails tomorrow. As opposed to analyzing why we are making decisions. So, for example, the fracking lobby. Why are we not calling for the scientific hydrological and geological data to see whether it would work? Why are we not calling on our many scientific institutions to look at the feasibility of fracking and the actual damage it would cause? These are not conversations we're having. This is not part of our discourse. I don't see this in the letters sections. I don't see it in the comments sections, but I'll get back to comments. And this is what civil society needs to be doing, to be engaging with these questions.